Hello, everyone. Welcome to the October Cybersecurity Insider Program. This month, our topic is a candid conversation with hacking experts, and we're going to share some lessons learned from pen testing. So if you do have questions throughout, please put them in the questions pane, and we will get to those towards the end of the presentation or the discussion. And right now, I'm going to turn it over to Mike Donahue to kick us off and get us started.
Thank you so much, Laura. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mike Donahue. I'm the Chief Delivery Officer at CloudWave. I hopefully had the opportunity to meet a lot of you in the past. I've been with the organization for 12 plus years in a multitude of roles. But within the last 3 months, I've taken on the role as Chief Delivery Officer, where I oversee our security operations practice and our technical and security services. I am not the star of the conversation today. I am really just the moderator. We have with us Hector Montsegur, who leads offensive research and also is our lead pen tester for CloudWave. So Hector, with that, would you mind introducing yourself and maybe giving a little bit about your background to the audience?
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, everyone. My name is Hector Montsegur. I am the lead pen tester here with CloudWave, and I support the team on a whole bunch of different fronts. Most of what I really bring to the team is knowledge and understanding of security concepts going back 20 plus years. Um, in my former life, I was an adversary. So at one point, I was the bad guy. And as the adversary, and I think this would apply to anybody in the room that has been on the internet or in the technology game or the different various industries over the last 25 plus years. A lot of us, and Mike and I were just talking about this, a lot of us started kind of the same way. Curious, young, naive, maybe in some cases, looking at security from the outside in, not really having access to tools like TryHackMe or BugCrowd or anything, or any of these cool platforms today. I started as a researcher, and then eventually I got into hacktivism. That's a conversation for another day. The point here that I wanted to kind of point out is that for all of this time, since the 1990s to today, I've been a team builder, someone that supports my teams. I try to improve the situations that kind of move forward. Like if I learn about a new vulnerability or attack vector, I'm applying it to all of my clients. If I find a way to improve my methodology, I'm doing the same exact thing. My goal is really to improve cybersecurity, not only for the organizations that I deal with, but also industries at whole. So now with CloudWave here, with Mike and his teams, what I end up doing is, I may either engage in internal or external pen test, maybe a red team, maybe a social engineering campaign. But aside from that, what really is helpful to the clients is not just a scan and here's your report, but it is having access to the knowledge base. So if you have questions about some areas of concern, hey, Hector, we think about migrating into a hybrid environment with Azure or Entra ID. Hey, Hector, we think about moving from Okta as an identity provider over to Duo or something else. Those conversations we could have. So that's kind of my space. I'm a researcher first and practitioner and security expert after that. I also have a podcast called Hacker in the Fed. So if you guys are curious about hacking topics, feel free to take a listen.
And with that, I will say Hector's being very modest. I can't recommend enough you go listen to that podcast. I listen to it every time there's a new episode that drops. The information that he shares, not only on the healthcare sector, but the broader security sector. Him and his coach, Chris Tarbell, who's worked for the FBI for a number of years, leading their cyber division. It's just a lot of great content. So thank you so much, Hector, for that background. And before we get into the back and forth conversation that Hector and I are going to have, really, we wanted to give the audience just an update on what we're seeing in the hacking world today, and a group that really became relevant in February of this past year. So certainly everyone on this call is very familiar with ransomware, but if you haven't heard, Ransom Hub is a ransomware group that's operating under a ransomware as a service model. What that means is that they have written the ransomware software and then license that software to other adversaries to carry out the actual attacks. So the bad guys are now having a channel business model with them. And why is that applicable to this conversation today? Within the last 3 to 6 months, CloudWave has personally seen 10 to 15 healthcare organizations been impacted by this ransomware as a service variant. When this slide was originally put together, the number was 210 total year to date. It's actually across the globe over 400 now. About 170 of those attacks have taken place in the US. And the way it works is that the affiliates really receive a large portion of the ransomware payments when it is paid. And I know in healthcare, that's not a very common practice. It's not one that I would say CloudWave would ever recommend. However, in other industries, it is a very common practice for organizations to pay that ransom. And in this kind of operating model, you'll see Ransom Hub is actually just taking a 10% for providing the software. And if you look to the bottom right of the screen, you'll probably recognize some of these names. Change Healthcare being one that impacted maybe in some way, shape, or form 80% of the US healthcare market. It was their ransomware as a service software that actually led to that taking place. And Hector, to that, have you come across, I know in a lot of what you do from a research perspective, any specific tactics or vulnerabilities that this organization in specific is taking advantage of in the space?
Yeah, I would say, unfortunately, what you're going to see a lot are patterns. Okay. And adversaries have been moving in patterns, since I've been around. Since I was a black hat myself. Um, back in my days, I hate to sound old here, but back when I was an adversary, we had rules of engagements. It was kind of like an unspoken rule, a law. Do not target hospitals or healthcare. You don't want to actually kill anybody. You don't want to target law enforcement because you don't want to kind of stir the bee's nest, right? And government, of course, leave them alone. But obviously, times have changed. And times have changed once the adversary discovered that they could monetize their breaches and compromises in a way that is structured and methodological, streamlines, structured, and that's where these ransomware hubs, in this case, Ransom Hub, are going to succeed, and they're going to continue to succeed and be successful so long as victims are paying, whether they're in the healthcare industry or not. Now, in terms of patterns, um, 20 years ago, a lot of 0 days were used. And for those of you that don't know what a 0 day is a vulnerability that has not been disclosed and or patched prior to the vendor providing you a security update. So people or bad actors will exploit those vulnerabilities prior to you being able to patch said vulnerability. And then at some point, 0 day vulnerabilities became monetized as well. So in the mid 2000s, the only people that could buy 0 day exploits weren't teenagers on IRC or some chat platform looking to trade their wares. Instead, you had governments purchasing those exploits at $1 million plus. But now, as ransomware became a thing and adversaries were able to have victims pay them, in some cases with double extortion, twice, now they could also afford those same exploits. So what you're seeing today, my friends, and with regards to emerging threats, you're looking at two distinct angles. You're looking at the use of 0 day vulnerabilities that there's really nothing you could do about until your vendor patches said vulnerabilities. You could put mitigating and technical controls to slow down or mitigate the damage, the impacts, especially if you follow some of the guidelines within or the concepts within zero trust and least privilege. Um, but the flip side of the 0 day attacks are, and this is the one that's going to upset you the most because of how easy and how simple it is, and that is info stealers. So here at CloudWave, we have access to some really ahead of the curve threat intel data, and I just looked at the data before I hop on here on the webinar with Mike, and the data set that I have access to has access to 30 million compromised computers. Out of those, there's about 11 million compromised Android devices, and there's about 4.3, close to 4.5 million compromised employee accounts. So if you have contoso.com as your business domain, and there is a computer that's been breached somewhere, and that computer's contents, passwords, credentials, session tokens, etc., API keys, are uploaded to these threat intel, I would say, marketplaces. An adversary could purchase those credentials for your business from your compromised employee's computer for pennies on the dollar. I've seen it as low as 50 cents, and I've seen it as high as 3,000. It all depends on the organization. It all depends on your revenue. So you're looking at a mix between zero-day attacks that you probably can't stop anyway, and info stealers, which are a result of your employees working from personal devices. When your employees are using personal devices and they start to download games, and those games have plugins, and they install those plugins, or they share the tablet or the laptop and their cell phone with loved ones, their partners, those partners can infect the machine by accident and indirectly made the employee, in this case your employee, insider threats to your organization. So info stealers and the use of zero-day exploits are rampant today, October 31st, 2024. Happy Halloween.
No, thank you so much for that, Hector. And kind of leading off of that, if I was to ask you to go back 2 decades ago and put on your black hat, working specific targeting healthcare, what are some of the tech and tooling that exists today in the marketplace that would make you think twice about wanting to try to carry out an attack, knowing that social engineering, phishing is probably the easiest entry point for a lot of organizations, but truly going into looking at penetrating an external vulnerability, executing lateral movement, going through your reconnaissance procedures, what are some of the tech and tooling in the industry today that would give you pause that potentially would lead to you being discovered?
That is a great question because it can be a complex one. There, if I were to go back in time, back to the early 2000s, mid 2000s, when the cybersecurity industry was first kind of starting off and tools were starting to develop. And unfortunately, many of you are victims of snake oil, right? That the security industry at one point was a lot of that. But we're fortunate that now, where we at today, where we stand, there's a lot of great tools that you can leverage. And each day that passes, there's a brand new tool that comes out. It's either a unicorn or it dies, unfortunately, because they couldn't get funding. There's a lot of great technology coming out. I'm very happy to see that. Now, if I were to, put myself in the black hat position again and start looking at potential targets, my methodology would change. Before it was more open and free, and you know what? I'm going to break in. If I break in, great. If I can't break in, it is what it is. Because back then, logging, centralization of logging and auditing of logs, SIMs weren't really a thing. And if they were super basic and very entry level. By the time that I would have been caught back in those days, I would have been done with the job. With the compromised breach, I would have moved laterally. I would have been able to modify logs. I would have deleted evidence of my existence within your network, right? Now it's a little bit different. What I'm looking for, especially when I'm doing an internal red team for a customer. So some of you guys in here have come to Cloudwave for internal pen test, or internal red team. Internal red team and pen test are different. We're gonna go into the differences later on. But in the situation where we've done internal red teams for our customers here, we set rules of regulation of engagement, and some of those rules of engagement could be, hey Hector, we want you to be able to compromise our network. We're going to maintain or keep our EDRs, NDRs, MDRs all active, not monitoring only, and we want to see how fast we could detect your compromises. We have one customer that said, okay, Hector, you were able to break into this one machine, but can you trigger detection? And this goes back to your question, Mike. Can you trigger detection, and how fast? Can you time how fast our SOC or proactive SOC jumps in and does triage and incident response and so on. And so one of the cool tools that I got to experience was like CrowdStrike Falcon, right? And SentinelOne has their own version of it, and other products have their own versions. But I love that interactive, rapid response, triage service that CrowdStrike offers with their Falcon product. Because yes, I broke into the machine over SMB, which is an old protocol. Yes, I was able to get a shell on said machine, but as soon as I executed the commands that would trigger CrowdStrike, in less than 2 minutes, the adversary, it's not the adversary, I'm the adversary in that case, but in less than 2 minutes, we had the Falcon people hop on a machine, they locked it down, they disconnected me from it, and then of course they started a back and forth thread with the client. Now, for an adversary, that's devastating, especially if you're utilizing things like a zero-day vulnerability, or you got into a very sophisticated social engineering campaign, or you did a supply chain attack, but you somehow made it to the internal network. So to be able to be caught within 2 minutes of the initial intrusion is devastating to an adversary that's monetizing said intrusion. Because as we all heard in our lives, time equals money. The same applies to the adversary. You see these guys here? You look at the screen right now, the hacking trends, Ransom Hub, they have a RAAS model. They're paying affiliates 90% of the payments, and then they're keeping 10%, right? Okay, you get the idea there. That 90% is not going to exist or transfer anywhere to the adversary, to the initial access broker, or even the ransomware hub here, or ransom hub, if you're caught within 2 minutes. That's problematic. So that would be, if I was an adversary, I would be concerned about that. I don't have concern about the customer catching me in an hour. I have concern with the customer catching me within 2 minutes. Because within the hour, I'm done with the job. I broke in, moved laterally, reconnaissance, information gathering, exfiltration, right? Um, that's all done within the hour. But 2 minutes, I'm just logging in. I'm doing initial recon, and then I'm disconnected. So, Mike, I hope I answered your question, but that's really some of the technology that I've seen work really well. Also, there's a couple of little small ones here. If you guys have invested in next generation firewalls, everybody in this room here today, okay? If you invested the money in next generation firewalls, the cool thing about those firewalls, or an NDR or XDR, whatever, right? The cool thing about those platforms is that they also include or have integrations. So if you have other products like a threat intelligence license, or you have other solutions that you're using to kind of centralize information, sending stuff to your SOC or your NOC or whatever SIM you're using, take advantage. Unfortunately, I've observed that some of my customers, they're purchasing these next generation firewalls and they're leaving it in default state. They might change the admin password, they might set up a couple rules, but they're not leveraging the next generation portion of it. And finally, DNS categorization. If you guys are not using DNS categorization for web content filtering on your internal network, then you're missing out. Because when an adversary sets up an infrastructure that contains a command and control environment, meaning they have a server that they're exfiltrating files to, data to, more than likely that server, that IP address, that subdomain, that domain, that hostname is not categorized by Cisco or IBM X-Force or any of those other providers. And since they're not categorized, you can block the traffic automatically and review and accept later on if it's legitimate traffic. So I hope I gave you guys some ideas on what would scare an adversary, centralization of logs, making sure you keep evidence, maintaining a resiliency, being able to get back online quickly, right? And then, of course, detection, response, and mitigation. Those are all that would concern me as an adversary today.
No, that's great, Hector. Thank you so much for going into that. And Laura, you can go ahead to the next slide. Um, Wanted to kind of pivot on that same topic though, as you're going in and doing different kinds of pen testing, which I know we're going to get into some of the misconceptions I think that exist when an organization hears what a pen test actually is. But as you're in an environment doing pen testing, what are the most common things that you're seeing that would be easy for an organization to fix? I know we touched on 0 days. That's a very reactive approach because we have to wait for the vendor to acknowledge it and push an alert out to the industry, or an advisory out to the industry, and then we have to take corrective action with, in many cases, hands on keyboard to execute that patch. But what are some of the things that you come across in your day to day that are common themes within the healthcare sector that organizations could do to better strengthen their overall posture?
Yeah, that is another fantastic question because the healthcare industry, and I've done, hundreds of pen tests, assessments against hospitals, healthcare industry, organizations, big and small, right? Um, and so some of the biggest takeaways that I have is that there's a lot of legacy environments, appliances, applications, software, hardware within these hospitals. And I spent a lot of time, especially dealing with you, Mike, and Jonathan, as part of your team. I came to cybersecurity as a non-healthcare person, right? I've been to a hospital, but I didn't understand the nuances to healthcare security and why, the industry has the kind of issues and gaps that I've seen. And so a big reason that I've seen, that I've heard for a lot of healthcare environments, networks, organizations having legacy appliances from 15 years ago is because 15 years ago, some of you guys paid 5, 10, 15, $20 million for that application or appliance. That was a massive investment for your healthcare provider, for your business, for your organization. The problem with having legacy systems like that on your network is, oh, and this is especially if the provider and or vendor went out of business, they were acquired, they're no longer supporting your products. Maybe you haven't purchased a support license in a couple of years. The problem with having these legacy environments in your network is that they automatically raise the risk of compromise and raise the severity of potential impact of compromise in your environment. Um, I've seen healthcare networks where, I do my pen test internal, I'm breaking into systems, that's part of my job, and then I'm breaking into a system that has a Linux kernel 2.2. For those of you that don't know much about Linux, Linux version, kernel version 2.2 is like 24 years old. And so what that means is that every vulnerability from 24 years back to now is likely applicable to that system, meaning that system is not going to be confidential, is going to be breached by somebody. If it's not going to be a bad actor, it's going to be an insider threat, which is a topic for another day. We can talk about that some other time. Um, and then also, because that legacy appliance or application or software hardware is inside of your network, you're probably always are going to fail your audits. So if you're trying to maintain compliancy, if you're doing work with the federal government, if you have to do, if you have to fit some sort of guideline, framework, whatever, more than likely you're going to fail at because those systems are still in your network. And every time I've seen those kind of systems on that kind of network, it's always been flat network. So that's the second issue you guys have, okay, in the healthcare. Not you guys per se, but I've seen a lot of healthcare environments. Flat networks, no segmentation, meaning that if an adversary gets into your office building, they get into your headquarters, maybe you hired somebody who's a rogue employee, insider threat. We've seen that a lot recently, by the way, with North Korean actors pretending to be American workers, getting a job at said company, and then, of course, now they have full carte blanche to your network. So you have rogue actors, bad actors, insider threats, and once they're inside your network, there's no segmentation, there's no access controls, there's no technical controls that mitigates someone from hopping from one machine to another. And then, of course, the password reuse. You combine all of these things together, and you basically have a massive problem. Your entire network is going to fail your audits, and it's completely vulnerable to all sorts of different attack vectors. Now, I want to give you guys some hints, some tips on how you can mitigate some of this stuff like today if you want, okay? I'm going to speed run through this. So we could always write this out or send you guys an email later after this. So the one thing you want to do that you can leverage today is doing an Active Directory audit. We do that for you, but you can do it yourselves to get a baseline as to where your Active Directory environment stands, right? And there's a bunch of different tools for that. Not a lot of great tools, but there's some tools that exist, and they'll give you some baseline as to where your AD environment stands. That's one. Two, um, if you have Windows connected or domain connected Windows machines in your network, you can set one GPO, root policy. Two, disable SMB v1 and enforce SMB signing on all your communications over SMB. What does that do for you? Well, that one GPO is going to eliminate a lot of the attack vectors that adversaries are going to use on your internal network by means of relay attacks. And I see that in 90% of the networks I work with. So if any of you guys are curious on this chat today, in this webinar today, you can use a tool like NetExec or Nmap to scan all of your Windows computers. And you know what you're going to see? SMB signing, security disabled. If you see that in your systems, which you can fix with one GPO, then you are vulnerable to relay attacks today. And of course, I'll give you more examples as we kind of move forward here, Mike.
No, that was awesome, Hector, and you actually read my mind because I'm a big believer that the security industry, based off of the rapid nature it continues to evolve, is probably the number one industry that involves buzzwords. And you hit one earlier when you mentioned zero trust. And I think in many cases, a lot of organizations get overwhelmed when they hear what does a zero trust architecture actually mean, because it's not necessarily a tool, it's a framework. It has multiple components that go into what you just mentioned, which is starting with an Active Directory audit. Do you know who has access to what? Where are my biggest risks? Who has my domain accounts? If this individual was compromised, how far can they go within the network? And I think you touching on one of the biggest challenges that we come across is legacy applications. Excuse me. Legacy applications through an acquisition. I've seen organizations that still have Valco running. For those that will get that reference, um, 4 companies ago. And really coming up with an idea or a framework or a methodology for how to mitigate that risk, knowing that as an organization, you still have to retain either historical records, you still have potentially 2 or 3 individuals in the organization that have to go into this platform on a monthly basis, quarterly basis, in some cases, even just annually have to go in once. I think you gave some great insight into immediate things that organizations can do to isolate those, whether it's through network segmentation, understanding Active Directory current state, as well as just disabling through GPOs that SMB signing protocol. And then one thing you didn't touch on, but I was going to mention is I think multi-factor authentication, and Hector, I'd love your opinion on this as it pertains into the zero trust architecture framework. I think multi-factor authentication is almost table stakes across all organizations and all sectors in today's industry. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. Multi-factor authentication is extremely useful, and you're going to stop a lot of the low-hanging fruit attacks. What's a low-hanging fruit attacks, my friend? I'll give you an example. Credential stuffing. If you have an employee that has a very busy personal life and they have accounts everywhere, but they're reusing the same password, and any of those sites is compromised, the credentials are stolen, your employee's credentials is going to be used to log right into your corporate network over VPN or whatever portal it is you guys are using, ADFS, whatever, right? Uh, MFA at that point will help you. It would help you mitigate the credential stuffing scenario and give you some notifications, some alerts as to, hey, by the way, somebody just tried to log in from Brazil into this corporate account from one of your executives at 3 in the morning Eastern time. This is anomalous, and they failed the multi-factor process. Now, that is useful information for you because all it took for you was to just implement MFA into your environment. Now, remember, as you start looking at MFA as a solution, and Mike hit it on the head, zero trust is a buzzword, and that's unfortunate because the concepts within zero trust are so important. But part of what makes zero trust such an interesting concept, a conglomeration of concepts, is that it tackles multiple issues at once. Least privilege, right? Do I want an intern? With all due respect to interns around the world, but do I want an intern who I just hired 2 days ago to have full, unfettered access to my internal network file shares? The answer is probably no. So we need to figure out a way to deal with permissions and access controls for those users. Do I want my executives who do a lot of traveling to Latin America, because they're opening up, we're thinking about opening up a hospital in Chile. We have a lot of executives traveling to Latin America. They're going to Colombia, Venezuela. They experimenting. They're really enjoying the continent. Um, do we want to set a geofence around this executive? Do we want to give them the permission to be able to access our corporate network from a hotel in Chile, right? These are things that you could start to tighten controls on using an identity provider, right? Like an Okta or Duo. There's a whole bunch of other solutions. You have Microsoft as well. Um, and then when you have identity management and you have a good identity provider, you can start to implement and set controls for MFA, how the MFA is used, how it could be utilized. You can prevent certain things like MFA exhaustion. I'm sure you guys have heard that, where somebody breaks into your account and they start spamming your phone with alerts to allow them to log into your account, right? That's exhaustion. Um, you implement some of those features, and guess what? Like Mike was alluding to, you start to mitigate a lot of these low-hanging fruit attacks, which, by the way, are probably some of the most successful attack vectors utilized by adversaries today. So food for thought. And I just want to point out a couple more things here, Mike, real quick before I move on. Um, the usefulness of something like a zero trust, if you have like CloudWave help you implement that, right? You're looking at least privilege. You're looking at things like micro segmentation. Are my interns who are part of the development department, should they be able to access our financial systems? If not, we need to segment them in their own little island and let them do the jobs and get access to the resources they need from there, but nothing beyond that. And then, of course, risk-based access controls. I'll give you guys a good example. If you have an executive traveling to Latin America, because they're looking at an acquisition, can we do a risk-based assessment using our identity provider or whatever other tools we have to identify whether or not the login from that executive is legitimate or not? Even a slight deviance in variables is good enough to trigger a warning or an alert or even action, right? So these are all good things to consider when you guys are trying to stay ahead of the curve when it comes to dealing with adversaries.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Hector. And Laura, we can go ahead to the next slide. Um, really wanted to get into a couple, I think, what are misconceptions around pen testing. And before we jump in directly to that, Hector, I wanted to ask you, can you describe, as you're engaging in an external, internal red teaming, what is your general approach to each one of those individual different engagements, and why you do certain things and why you may not do certain things?
Yeah, no, this is a great topic. I've been doing pen testing for most of my life, most of my career. I would say that the biggest problem that I'm seeing is, and now that I'm doing more sales, I'm interacting with clients and leads directly. I kind of understand the big picture. I'm able to help during the process. But a lot of other security companies are not like CloudWave. They're not going to put like their main research on a sales call to help with scoping and help identify with the customer what it is that they need. So a lot of security companies, you have a sales guy, you reach out to them, hey, I would like a pen test. And the problem that organizations, both on the vendor side and on the client side, is that maybe the type of pen test you're looking for is probably not what you need. Or maybe you don't know what it is that you need. Or maybe you're just trying to satisfy a guideline or a framework or a policy. Or maybe you just want to lower your cyber insurance premiums and you just want to get a scan done, right? So I want to go through some differences with you guys very quickly, because I don't want anybody in this room today and whoever's watching at home to walk away still confused as to what pen testing is, right? So you have a penetration test. That's a pen test. And the purpose behind a penetration test is to actively identify, probe, validate potential vulnerabilities, and can we convert them into attack paths, which will lead us to red teaming, and we'll get that in a second. So a pen test, you're bringing in a vendor that's going to help you identify gaps within your security posture, identify issues in your attack surface. These could be vulnerabilities, these could be misconfigurations, or they could be just an interesting finding that you could investigate and utilize towards your maturity program or maturing your security program. You have a black box penetration test, you have a white box penetration test. You also have a gray box penetration test. A black box penetration test, whether it's external, internal, whatever it is, um, that is when you provide me the least information possible for me to engage your environment. And this is essentially what they call adversary emulation. Okay, you're emulating a real world attack against your organization. Doesn't matter from whether it's inside or outside. The idea here is to see what it is that the adversary, which is me in this case, sees when I'm trying to break into your network. Okay, so that's a black box component type. You have the white box, which is you give me every bit of information that I need to understand your environment so that I can have a broad understanding of context and perspective, have an understanding of your configurations and whatever potential misconfigurations you have in place and why they're in place. So with that information, I'm able to strategize and I can focus on key areas rather than coming into your network blindly. They both have pros and cons. And of course, a gray box is when you mix the both. Hey, Hector, I want you to do an internal pen test, but I want you to do a black box external. I want to see if you can break into our network from the outside. But once you're inside, I want you to do an active directory audit. I want you to look for low-hanging fruit. I want you to see if there's any vulnerabilities that you can leverage to compromise our environment. Because I don't feel like we're 100% resilient yet. We could do that. Okay. Now you have the external and the internal, and it's pretty straightforward, but I'm gonna break it down. On the external side, what am I looking for as the adversary and as your vendor here, as your partner? I'm looking for how many assets do you have externally, how many domains you have, how many subdomains, how many of those subdomains have SSL certificates, how many misconfigured certificates do you have, and how many alternate names those certificates have for host names. Because sometimes customers tend to add a whole bunch of different host names to a certificate, and it leaks internal domain information. Okay. Again, on the external side, I'm looking at your DNS records. I'm looking at your SSL certificates. I'm looking at threat intelligence. Because not only am I going to scan your environment, your external assets for vulnerabilities, I'm also looking at your human vulnerabilities. If there's evidence that you have a breached employee and that employee is actively logging into accounts with his corporate email, and I know it, and I could see it, and I could purchase it, I'm going to let you know because there are technical vulnerabilities and human vulnerabilities, and I'm going to highlight both of these. So that's what an external looks like. On the internal, it's way more nuanced. There's way more variables. You guys get the idea. But here's what I don't do. Here's what we don't do. We do not do denial of service. We're not trying to cause you business impact. There are companies out there that offer DDoS testing. We don't do that because DDoS testing in this case would mean that we would blast your network with a ton of traffic to see if you can withhold it. And honestly, in most cases, I have not seen organizations be able to hold DDoS as well. Maybe the websites do because they're hidden behind Cloudflare, but not their external mail server, not their old ADFS endpoint, not their internal network because they're Cisco devices from 20 years ago. Any internal burst of traffic is going to crash those devices and bring the entire hospital offline. So, oh, and one thing that I really want you to really walk away from this conversation with is that when you bring in a pen test, regardless if you're curious about your security posture, or you have to just deal with a deadline or deal with a guideline or deal with your cyber insurance provider, whatever it is, take advantage. Talk to your vendor. If it's CloudWave, talk to CloudWave, talk to Mike, talk to his team. Say, look, we do pen tests every year, but we're concerned because the moment we get a pen test report January 1st, January 2nd, the report is already obsolete. My industry is changing, Mike, and I need to be more continuous. What can we do here? Well, there's ways we could deal with that. I agree that continuous pen testing and assessments are definitely needed in 2024. If research comes out today, a vulnerability comes out today, it's fixed tomorrow. There's a new one the next day, right? So we got to be continuous about this. So the one thing I would tell all of you here is, if you build a relationship with a vendor that you trust, that you like the reports, you like the deliverables, try to work out a relationship, a deal where you can do multiple pen tests throughout the year, even if it's just once a quarter, and you work out pricing based off of that, right? Rather than a one-off pen test, you're getting 4 pen tests for the year or 8 pen tests if you do, bi-monthly, or more or less, and you're probably gonna get better pricing, my friends, right? Take advantage. That's one. Two, if you are not so technical, let's say you're a CISO, you got the executive job because of your experience and time, and you've been with the company 30 years, that's great. I have no problem with you. But if you're not a technical person, you should probably hire someone that's on the technical side to support you, whether it's a senior security engineer or an assistant, somebody that already has that experience that they can work with you in tandem to understand where your gaps are. And if you don't know where your gaps are, this is where you bring a vendor to help you identify those gaps. From there, you can strategize. Trust me, ladies and gents, cybersecurity is scary. It's not supposed to be friendly, right? Just like doing physical security, just like being a bouncer at a club or working at a military base, right? You're always going to deal with risk. Now, what we have to kind of figure out is, can we deal with this risk in a way where we can implement mitigating controls in a way that's cost effective and it's not going to destroy our budget? So, Mike, I hope I gave I gave the audience a nice breakdown of different types, and we can go into more nuanced questions after this.
Yeah, absolutely, Hector. And one question that came to mind as we were going through was, and it's been a long time since I've been technical. I'm one of those people that you mentioned that have kind of moved up, and now I'm a talking head. If I was, a CIO or CISO at a health system, and I go back to when I sat in that role 5 years ago, and I didn't know where I stand, and know I need to identify my risk profile as an organization, and don't know enough about the nuances that go into it, got you on a call, what would your recommendation be going through black box, white box, gray box, external, internal, but I have a limited budget? Because that is a question I get quite often is, I have a limited budget, or this is an unbudgeted item that I know I need to complete, but I can't go and get a full-blown internal, external, black box, red team type exercise. So what would your recommendation be to me if I asked you that question? I need to understand my risk profile. Where am I going to get the most bang for my buck this year as I, put forth an initiative internally to get budget dollars allocated next year?
Yeah, that's another great question because I hear this all the time as well. I hear this all the time from all sorts of organizations and customers. In fact, before this webinar, I had a big meeting with a presentation, and that was part of the conversation. Hey, Hector, we have 57,000 members as part of our association. We want to be able to monitor all 37,000 members. But we looked at a threat intel platform, it was $50,000 per customer. We don't have that budget, man. What can we do to get a baseline and understanding of where we stand as an organization? Um, and so here's how I would tackle it. If I was a CISO, I'm not technical, I need to get some sort of baseline. I'm going to do some research and I'm going to start building out relationships. I'm going to look at who are some of the leaders in my industry. So I'm in healthcare. I'm looking at companies like CloudWave and its competitors. I'm having conversations. Hey guys, here's where I'm at. Here's my budget. That's the max. That's the best I could do. What can we do together? Just a reminder, we haven't had a pen test in 5 years. Can we come up with a strategy so that I could walk away and be able to present to my stakeholders and my board and my investors and whoever, here's where we stand. Here's what we need for next year's budget so that we can start dealing with these gaps. If that's the scenario, that's the premise, great, I got you. So I'm Hector. I'm a CISO, non-technical. I do my research. I find CloudWave. I speak to Mike's team. I'm on the phone with Mike's team. Hey guys, I have 20 grand for the entire year. That's all I have. There's nothing more, nothing less. Um, Here's the problem. I just walked into this job. I have no idea when's the last time we did a pen test, and I'm very concerned because I'm looking at the news. A lot of hospitals are getting hit with ransomware. We have 5,000 assets, internal assets. We have 300 remote workers, and we have 4 sites. Each site goes to the main website. Okay, we have 4 domains all going to the same website. What do you recommend? And I'll hear the options. And what I would do for the baseline is I would get a black box external penetration test with threat intelligence. I want to know if my external assets are vulnerable to vulnerabilities today. Do I have any assets that I'm not aware even exist? That would be the DNS and certificate enumeration. Do I have any employees that are breached? Mike, you know my budget. You know where I stand. I have zero baseline. I need a baseline. Can you get me a black box external view of my environment? And I'm hopeful that you have some decent findings there, because next year I want to come back to you to discuss my internal network, because I know by next year I have a better budget. That would be my approach. Okay. The reason why I would go with an external black box in that scenario is because, assuming the external black box comes back with some, maybe a couple high severity issues, maybe a couple mediums, maybe 10, 20 issues in total, right? As expired certificates, maybe an open FTP server, whatever. You guys get the idea. Imagine internal network penetration tests with 5,000 assets that have not been tested or assessed in at least a minimum of 5 years. You're going to have a pen test report in the hundreds of pages. Mike, you've seen some of my reports. Mike, you've seen some of my reports. They're 400 or 500 pages. And those are customers that have not done an internal pen test in X amount of years. And for a CISO that's non-technical to get a report of that caliber, they're not going to be prepared for it. They're going to be overwhelmed, and nothing's going to happen. When they go back to the board and say, look, I spent my entire budget on this massive internal pen test. I have 500 pages. I'm not really sure how to deal with this. Now, the board is going to start looking at you funny and say, well, do we have the right guy for the job? So that would be my approach, Mike. I hope I answered the question the way it makes sense, but that's how I feel.
No, you absolutely did, Hector. Thank you so much for that. And you touched on something that you and I have seen going through this. And I think, said differently, one of the misconceptions that I've come across, even in the last year, overseeing this team, is organizations confusing a real internal pen test with what I would call or classify as a vulnerability scan, as a part of a vulnerability threat management program, where it's just
That's
looking
right.
for those those advisories or vulnerabilities that exist on those assets. A real
That,
world example is, we
mhm.
had an organization, and Hector knows about this, that through the kickoff call, and I don't think I probably did it justice, going through what the expectations were. However, reached out through the executive team and said, hey, we've been, internal pen test has been going on for 2 weeks. I've had one every year. It usually can be turned around in a handful of days. I'm really hoping this is a great report, because it just seems to be taking a lot longer than I would have anticipated. And then got a note as soon as we delivered the report and said, okay, I've never had an internal pen test. Because to Hector's point, it was a thoughtful, probably 40, 50 pages of great content with thoughtful recommendations. But when we get into the appendices and going into what those real vulnerabilities are and how they can actually be actioned, where it's not just here's your vulnerability list, this is how this vulnerability can actually be actioned to harm the organization, that's where the reports get into the hundreds. And I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions I've come across recently, is confusing a vulnerability threat management program or organizations that are representing internal pen testing, and then coming in and just doing a Nessus scan of the environment and saying, here's your vulnerabilities. So no, I think that
Yeah.
was super helpful, Hector. And Laura, I think, wanting to be respectful for the time, and
Mhm.
I hope the audience can tell, don't put Hector and I on a phone call for too long, because we could talk for 10 hours. um, but hopeful that this was time well spent for the audience. And really what we wanted to present to you today is insight into how you should spend your budget dollars as it pertains to penetration testing, insights into the industry, what we're seeing, tips for stopping some of the TTPs that we're seeing in the industry today, and making some recommendations for your organization to go back and think about, even without the use of a provider, going back to your system admin or your network team and saying, can we run an audit of Active Directory and show me all the domain users? Can we get a GPO crafted that's going to disable SMB signing? And those are things that we're here to help for, obviously. But hopefully this was a very helpful session to the audience. And one of the things, as a part of being a member of the Cyber Insider program, Laura, if you can go to the next slide briefly, we are, this is new for the Cyber Insider program, but we are offering, 15% off of our tabletop simulation package. And for those that aren't familiar with that, that is our end-to-end tabletop simulation across what we think are the three key areas of all health systems, where it's the internal IT staff, the executive team, and then the clinical team. And we're also, extending that to our external penetration testing service. Some of the details are on the bottom of the slide. Laura is going to put something in the chat that's just, if you're interested, we just ask that you fill out the form by November 15th. Honestly, if you fill it out November 25th, that's okay. We'll still honor this, but we're putting this forth until the end of the year, that if it's executed and signed, and as long as we have line of sight to have it delivered or scheduled by the end of Q1, March 31st of 25, that offer will stand. So, please give that some consideration. And I think one of the interesting things that Hector and I, and you heard him mention Jonathan Weiss, who does a lot of work on our advisory services team and leads that organization, have been working on is, how can we elevate the external pen testing service? Fully acknowledging that in many cases it's a commodity that a lot of organizations do. But one of the things that we're putting together as a part of our pen testing service, our external pen testing service, is really expanding that into third-party security testing, firewall rule analysis and best practice. And then after the report is delivered and remediations are in place, we will come in and do another full scan and retesting of the environment to ensure that previous remediations were corrected. So just food for thought for the people on the call as you're looking at needs for even next year and planning purposes. Hector is the one that drives all of this workforce, and we have a group of people underneath him as well that support him. But this is something that we're excited about. And then with that, Laura, I'll go to you to see if there's been any questions put in the chat for myself or Hector. I'm sure Hector is going to get the majority of them, if there are any.
Okay, thanks, Mike. We did have a couple of questions come in. The first one is, we perform phishing exercises through our training partner. Is that protecting our organization effectively? And also, what about the risks AI is creating?
Yeah, I am for all sorts of testing, social engineering testing to your partners, to your vendors, even if you do it yourselves, right? You know your employees better than the adversary. So if you're able to leverage certain bits of information that only you would know, and maybe an adversary can know with some reconnaissance, even better. What you're really looking for is not to admonish your employees for clicking on the link and submitting credentials. No, no, no. What you're looking for is, if the employee falls for the fish, are they going to report it upstream and help us fix it? If your employees submit credentials, realize they've been phished, and do not report it, that is a problem. So yes, testing is fantastic. Make it continuous. If you can do it once a month and change the sample of people you're testing, even better.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that, Hector. That it's, to me, it's not a or statement. It's more of an and statement, that
Mhm.
phishing is one of the most commonly used ways to infiltrate an environment. So that ongoing education,
Yeah.
and we eat our own dog food on this. At CloudWave, we go through ongoing phishing attempts led by our internal IT organization. We don't have any warning, even myself. And one of the things that we've actually put in place is that if we have repeat offenders, which I think is something that every health system is challenged by, how do we, at what point do you force re-education? So if you have a policy that says if someone fails to back-to-back phishing attempts, do they have to go through a training class? Do you have that training
Hmm.
material presented? That's something that we've actually developed at Cloudway for internal use is if we have someone that fails back-to-back phishing attempts,
Hmm.
they have to take a 4-hour class in order to improve their overall cyber hygiene and knowledge of the industry. And then the other part of that question was around AI, Hector, and I'd love
Oh,
your opinion of how you're seeing AI,
yeah,
impact the cyber landscape, and maybe even from, how the adversaries are potentially leveraging it to gain speed of entry into organizations.
absolutely. Yeah, I'm sorry I missed that second part. So I've been doing a lot of research into AI over the last several years. I'm a researcher after all, so I have to stay ahead of the curve. I always tell people as a joke, I'm always in a constant battle against obsolescence. The moment I want to take a break from cybersecurity, I'm already obsolete. So AI is an interesting thing because we've had it for quite some time. For those of you customers in this room today, vendors, partners, whatever, what have you, if you've ever purchased a DLP software, data loss prevention software, or you've ever purchased an EDR, 10 years ago when CrowdStrike first came out, or whatever it was they came out, you've been leveraging AI this whole time. Um, Data loss prevention software, depending on the software, they will use a signature-based system. They will use a rule-based system, but then they'll also use user and behavior analytics. That's machine learning and AI, depending on implementation. Your EDRs, your NDRs, your XDRs have been using AI for many years. So from a defensive perspective, AI has been a blessing to all of you in this room, right? Everybody in this room has been able to breathe a little bit better, sleep a little bit better because your tools are utilizing the latest technology to identify, detect, and hopefully remediate adversaries. From the adversary's perspective, it's not that fun. Right now, as an adversary, you could make polymorphic malware, which you could have did before anyway. You could create really interesting and email filter bypassing content. But you could have wrote that manually as well. Um, so from the adversary's perspective, I think that the defensive teams and you guys in here have the higher ups. You guys are in a much better place than the adversaries. That doesn't mean the adversaries are not going to utilize AI for sophisticated attacks in the future. They're just not there yet. That's the reality.
Okay, great. Thank you, Hector.
No,
And
that's
there's,
awesome.
yeah, there are a couple questions that came in around how do you determine pricing for internal and external pen tests? What are the factors? And do we also offer social engineering testing?
Well, Mike can answer the questions on like the pricing model. I could answer the technical perspective. So here's what we do very quickly. So for social engineering, we do email phishing, voice phishing with using AI for voice changers. We do SMS phishing, which works really well, by the way. I think you guys need to do training on SMS-based phishing because it's actually super successful. And then finally, because of, we have clients that ask us to emulate attacks. We emulated the Hong Kong AI deepfake scenario from last year, and so now we can do deepfake attacks as well. So if you have a healthcare network, you have a CEO that's always on TV, always on YouTube. You give me the content, I'll emulate the content, and I'll literally put your CEO in a meeting with your CFO and try to get a full wire transfer out. Right? Obviously, we're not going to transfer the money out, but we'll stop at a certain success, uh, line. Internal pen testing, external pen testing, social engineering, as I mentioned, mobile applications, web applications, you name it, we do it. We have an awesome team of security researchers that are constantly hacking away and adding to their portfolio. So just a heads up on that.
Yeah, and just to jump in on the pricing side, it really comes down to a number of factors of number of total assets. If we're looking at an external pen testing, for example, when it's, as Hector mentioned, we're looking at user accounts, what potential dark web breaches or where those accounts are being seen in the industry. It's going to come down to number of accounts and number of external assets that we're going to
Mhm.
be actively scanning and infiltrating as a part of that. And that goes the same for internal. If we're limiting it to a subset of the infrastructure where you have crown jewels on a
Mhm.
segmented network, really want to see, can you get into my EHR? Can you get into my clinical decision-making system, my financial system? We can break that out where it doesn't have to be the entirety of the network. But really, it's a handful of scoping questions around number of assets. Are we just doing the scanning, lateral movement, or are we doing some of the advisory things that Hector mentioned as well, where we're doing that audit and assessment of Active Directory as
Yeah.
a part of our internal environment testing? So hope that answered the
And,
question, but we can certainly get into more details on that as well.
and by the way, Mike, if you don't mind, I know time is running out here, but I just want to add one note to the internal testing. Um, since we're emulating an adversary in your network, we are auditing your Active Directory environment during the pen test. So, unlike other companies, we're actually going to include the Active Directory audit as part of the internal pen test. It's not going to be a second line item. So, I know a lot of companies separate those. We don't. You're going to get the AD audit as part of the internal pen test. So, heads up on that. If I were you guys, I would take advantage of that nice little discount and set it up for next year, for sure.
Okay, great, thank you. We had a couple questions asking for the links to your podcast, Hector, so I will include that in the follow-up email that I
Okay.
send out to everyone. So we'll include that. And just a reminder, for the November Cybersecurity Insider Program, we will be moving that 1 week earlier due to the Thanksgiving holiday. So that will be on Thursday, November 21st. And the topic will be a panel discussion looking ahead at cybersecurity trends and a focus for 2025 to help with your planning. And then we'll also be announcing some exciting updates to this program as we go into the new year. So make sure and attend that one on November 21st. Any closing remarks, Hector or Mike?
Very quickly, I
I
would
just
say
want,
that. Oh, I'm sorry, Mike. Go ahead.
I was just going to thank you, Hector and Laura, for putting this together. Hector, your time, for joining us, and thank everyone for taking the time out of their day to jump on this. I really do appreciate it, and I hope it was helpful.
Oh yeah, I agree. Beautiful. I'm happy to still, half the people here. That's great. Webinars tend to end a little bit early for a lot of folks. So big shout out to everybody here staying with us. Big shout out to Laura. Big shout out to Mike, the rest of the CloudWave team. The one thing I'll tell you is this, guys. In terms of advice and my parting words. Oh, by the way, feel free to add me on LinkedIn. I'll gladly answer any questions you guys may have. The one thing I'll tell you is that yes, sometimes cybersecurity can be scary, right? But at the end of the day, you are the captain of your ship. You have all the capabilities to deal with these gaps and risks and concerns. Sometimes it's okay just to reach out to a partner. This is why having trusted vendors as partners like CloudWave is going to go very long for you along your journey. You're not alone in this, right? And each of us in here has been breached or compromised, whether directly or indirectly. So never fear asking a question because you feel like it's not a question you should be asking. But please do reach out and communicate. Trust me, we got your back. And that's it, guys. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Hector.
Yeah,
Thanks, Mike.
thank you, everyone.
Have a good day.
Bye.
Happy Halloween, everyone. Thank you.